Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we're joining from today.
I'm joining from Lisarow on the lands of the Darkinjung people.
And I am joining from the lands of the Nyungbul people of the Bundjalung Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. We acknowledge their deep and ongoing connection to land, waters, language and culture, and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Okay, so today on Femmebot, what happens when creative integrity meets artificial intelligence? And what gets lost when empathy is seen as a nice to have?
Our guest today we've been trying to get on since we launched, even before we launched the podcast, and her name is Jen Dobbie. And she's a creative strategist turned technologist with a sharp mind and even sharper pen. She's worked across agencies, startup, and big tech, and she now helps brands navigate that messy middle between storytelling and systems.
From AI to DEI, Jen's been speaking very candidly about the emotional cost of progress and the creative leadership needed to move forward without losing what matters, which we're all about. And we are thrilled to have you here, Jen. Welcome to Femmebot.
Thank you. That was such a lovely intro. We've all talked a bit about imposter syndrome, so I sat very carefully and didn't say anything. But it was lovely, and I'm so delighted to be here. It took a while, and that's on me, so I'm sorry. But thank you for asking me, and I'm excited to be here.
We wanted to start with your journey, Jen, just because obviously it's one that resonates with us because you are a creative, but you've also moved into this tech space just like us. Can you give us a bit of background and how you got your start?
Yeah, absolutely. So I moved to Australia about 24 years ago, and I always worked in advertising, but I started out in account service. Back in those days, you couldn't earn enough as a junior copywriter to get sponsored to stay. So I accepted the dark side and went into account service, and it turned out I really loved it, actually. I worked at some great agencies, and I think what I found interesting, looking back now, I realized that a skill that I think I have now at that time was quite difficult for me. My brain tends to jump from the really big picture that's going on and huge strategies right down into the tactical, into the minutiae. And I think as I progressed throughout my career, it was really clear I belonged on the creative side, just in the way that I was working. I was lucky enough to have an amazing creative director, Dave Bell, who used to let me ghostwrite some briefs as a copywriter. And then following my experience there, I kind of at some point decided, look, it's sink or swim. You're going to have to go over eventually to copywriting. So that's what I did, and kind of spent 10 years working my way up from freelance copywriter through junior and senior roles and up to creative director. But I think really where I found myself is, again, it comes back to the way that my brain works. And it's that ability to think about the big thing and the little thing at the same time. When I hit tech about 5.5 years ago and I started working remotely at a scale up out of New York, it became really apparent really quickly that thinking about the high level, in that case, the brand, and as well as consistently thinking about the tiny little moments, every interaction that a customer's going to have or a potential customer's going to have is actually what was needed in tech. And so it felt like a really natural fit when I got there, and I've been in tech ever since. So yeah, for the last sort of 5.5 years now.
Amazing. And moving from agency to brand side, what is the future of agencies? I'd love to hear your thoughts around this. And, how is it shifting? What is a future agency going to look like? Is it going to be internal with a brand? How's it going to sit?
Yeah, I think, wow, what a teeny tiny topic to get into, right?
I just love because you brought it up, because you started in agency and then you went brand side throughout your journey. So why and what does that look like in the future? Yeah.
Yeah, and look, I definitely have opinions on it. I think the fair thing to say in the current environment is that all our opinions on it should be shifting because the environment is shifting. But in terms of what I've done and why I did it, I've gone, I guess, 3. So I've been a client. I was actually a client for a while at Toyota. I worked agency side and I've worked brand side as well within scale-ups, particularly in tech. And for me, again, the journey of creativity particularly has always always been about understanding all the different viewpoints. And so it used to get me into kind of awkward conversations if I wanted to move, like with recruiters, because they couldn't pigeonhole me into, what's the most useful package to sell? Like, do I like being agency side? Do I like being within a business? I think what's interesting now, and maybe, in terms of my experience, is that's kind of the experience that everybody needs to have now, both on an individual level and also on a broader agency level. If we look at the way the different holding groups are managing the environment that we live in from a creativity perspective at the moment, we have got some who are kind of grouping down and organizing little specialist agencies within themselves. So that's kind of lots of small in-house agencies with holding groups in terms of that model. And I think that specialist within a broader supporting network may continue to thrive. I think as long as we look at the terms of the adoption of AI, for example. But then I think also from an agency perspective, this will probably take us into a broader conversation about AI more generally. But I think from a creative perspective, what's so interesting is people are very frightened about AI. And I do think there's a lot that we don't understand yet about where it's going. But what's great from a creative standpoint is, look, AI is going to continue a proliferation of slop. There's always been a lot of creative slop and just like nonsense in the middle. But from an individual and an agency perspective, what it also allows us to do is have extraordinary excellence. So I think where we've got smaller indie agencies who have got that extraordinary depth of thought, they've been founded by incredible creative leaders with long-term backgrounds, long-term experience. And now they have the advantage of AI as well and a younger generation of creative coming through. I think at the one end, they will absolutely thrive. And then at the other end, we have individuals who now have access to extraordinary scale, which AI can give them, and kind of their imagination being the only limit. I think in terms of that agency model, the push and pull, what's really interesting in the broader topic at the moment is that conversation around holding groups. As I said, I think those that continue to specialize and chunk down internally are going to lead there. But I think it's much more interesting to talk about what the indies are doing at the moment and how creativity and AI can thrive together in that space.
And that's genuinely how it can help creatives. But you have spoken about it flattening originality as well. So what did you mean when you speak to that as well?
I think the difficulty for all of us as we embrace AI is the evolution of the tech for AI in any field, but in creativity particularly. It's moving so fast. It's moving faster than any of us can understand. It's moving faster than human evolution, societal evolution. And so the difficulty within that is everything becomes quite bland. We kind of lean into this loss of nuance, which we have been seeing generally anyway. If we look at storytelling more broadly as an art, I think if we look at any kind of discourse, the creative discourse, political discourse, those on different fundamental ends, that's where the noises are coming out and we're losing nuance. I think that's where the flattening is happening that concerns me. It's sort of like, I don't know, like storytelling whack-a-mole, right? Well, like, let's make things faster, let's make it shorter, let's make more big noise things happen. And in that way, it becomes less considered, less nuanced, less room for craft, less room for the humanity. But again, I come back to that theme, which is, I believe that comes out in the wash in good news, in a positive way, because what we end up with is the people who are willing to, or who have the expertise and the experience to think that through and still create extraordinary storytelling moments, they're still going to stand out. We look at what's starting to happen now and we see IRL events are massively taking off. We're looking at musicians having the biggest tours of all time, the longest tours of all time. We're looking at retailers who are willing to invest in creativity at that luxe end of the market. Even their bricks and mortar stores are really thriving. So I think what we find is, if we try to move away from that flattening of creativity, what's exciting, what's interesting is still much bigger than that. It's still much more positive. I think when I've talked about that flattening of creativity, it's the risk for everybody. If you're not quite sure what's going on, if the uncertainty is the thing, you kind of lean into, well, I'll do what I was doing anyway. I'll just do it with AI. And that's when everything becomes very homogenized and very dull.
I agree. So I use AI for admin and stuff that I don't really want to do with my job. And when I've tried to use it for creative, I quite often have found that it, rather than lean in, I guess, to my intent, it does generalize it and it just loses that essence. And how can it, I mean, obviously learning to cue it and train it to think like me. To an extent, I have done that, but I feel that any time I have tried to use AI to help me with a pitch or a response to brief, I have had to abandon because it's just losing the magic, or it's broadening out something that I wanted to go quite niche into, or it's just not quite, for me, it hasn't worked, which is actually, it feels somewhat of a relief, like that part of my job is still mine. And yeah, I mean, obviously there are certain elements that I can bring it in for down the line of the idea, like perhaps, once I've really found where I want to go. But yeah, with initial brainstorming, I find it isn't quite it's not helpful for me. It takes me off on a tangent that I wasn't wanting to go, or it just hasn't. Yeah, it's not quite there yet for me anyway. And I kind of hope it doesn't, because then, what's the point of me being there? And do you find that for yourself? I mean, obviously, if you're using AI, if you're using it in a creative space, is that your experience?
I think there's so much to unpack in that. It's really interesting for me. I've been looking at it in a couple of different ways recently in the work that I've been doing. So on that individual level, but also on the broader level, where I've come to at the moment on an individual level, sure, I've had similar experiences to you. But I think what's really interesting in it is I'm starting to believe that there's two things that don't have to be completely mutually exclusive, right? So on the one hand, yeah, absolutely, it's broadly trained. It's a large language model, so it speaks in generalities. But I think what that does mean is, particularly if we're looking at diverse voices in the creative space, it then somehow becomes incumbent upon us to use AI more and make this generality include other people as well, different people as well. Because I suppose the conundrum that I look to get my head around is, in the longer term, AI isn't going anywhere. So we're left with a situation where we either back away from it because it's not doing what we need it to do. It doesn't feel genuine to us. And exactly as you said, we've all had those same, well, that's not in any way what we're trying to achieve. And it comes back with some kind of broad, homogenized, boring nonsense. But on the other hand, the reason for that is there isn't enough diversity in it already. Yeah. There isn't enough diverse thinking. So you get kind of stuck in this cycle of, dependent on your day or the mood or the job, or do you want to be pragmatic and optimistic about it and part of the solution and lean into it, using it in a way that it becomes a partner to you. But then I think the second conversation that's so interesting and we've been having a lot of lately is around the actual ability to form consistent, cohesive thought. Because if we look at what AI can do for so many creatives, I spoke earlier about indie agencies doing really, really well when they combine the most modern, most bleeding edge AI that they can find with heritage creative thinking, right?
Yeah.
And I say that really carefully because I believe that a lot of the best work is coming out of people who have that real academic and trained ability to think creatively. And they've been doing it for a really long time and they know what they're doing. And you can see, 15 steps ahead. This is how this is going to work. This is why it's going to work creatively. This is the excitement. This is the warmth. This is the humanity of it. And those are the people we now need to be training AI. Because for me, the thing that worries me is, are we now opening ourselves into a generation of creatives? If you take it to its logical conclusion, we look at people my daughter's age, so people who are sort of 13, 14 now. When they come into the workforce in a couple of years' time, they're going to need to learn to think creatively. Will they follow that brainstorm thought? Will they know the difference between, a creative territory and actually really getting into a concept and nutting that down and why things will work and won't work and connect and won't connect. I think what's really fascinating from a creative perspective is we are at a tipping point now where we have the ability to make sure that AI has all the goodness of the people who actually learned how to do that, so that it evolves with us from a human perspective, because it's already out thinking us from a speed perspective. We've got to put the humanity into it. That's my current thought process on it, but it's changed, and I think will continue to evolve, because it can be a very frustrating experience at the moment, exactly as you said, Claire.
So you're kind of saying that there's a diverse range of people to be using AI and training it, but then also, that's to create that thinking for the younger generation. But I think a lot of the fear with creatives doing that, I don't know, is that the new generation of creatives are going to be lazy because the AI will replace the thinking, because it's been trained by this diverse range of extremely incredible creatives.
Right, it's a circular thought pattern, right? And so
Yeah.
my current place on that journey is it's felt as though the discourse around AI, I think, for probably the last 6 months has been incredibly negative, but in a fear-based way. And of course it has. And I'm absolutely not advocating for just random adoption of AI against everything else. Of course I'm not. I'm very much about the human-centric approach to life and to creativity. But my current thinking is, what we do need to navigate, and what is absolutely certain, is there is, from this moment onwards, going to need to be a balance between human creativity and AI creativity. And for me, the way that it's feeling at the moment is more of a pragmatic and optimistic pushback on the fear-mongering that's happening. I'm absolutely not on one side or another, because that's what I argue against, just taking one side or the other. What I talked about recently in a speech I gave was that the most radical thing that we can do at the moment is to be in the middle, is to accept that fence sitting is something we might need to do a little bit of at the moment, because we don't know. We don't know what the answer is.
And won't it become, I listened to a podcast, it was a while ago now, but it was about AI use in university, but it just reminds me of your daughter. And it'll come to a place of education having to obviously update the way of working, like we used to reference where we were getting our work from. Back then it was textbooks or encyclopedias, but you've got to do that with AI now in university. So it's referencing and supporting your arguments that way. It's almost like that same idea will come into play in creative as well, so that our kids and students are still having to back their process, because otherwise how will they learn? It's a bit scary.
Exactly. And I absolutely agree with that. I think what's exciting about that is the broader thought that it encourages us all to have. So for example, in my process of it, thinking exactly stuff like that, God, what if they go to uni and it's not, they're just, spitting stuff out? And so my pushback on that is to encourage my children and the juniors who I work with, just always keep thinking about it, question where it came from. Does it make sense? Just run a bullshit detector test over it. Like, I'm reading this, does it actually seem like something that could have happened? Like, maybe I'll do a little more research myself. What I love about that is that thoughtfulness, I think, is something that we can all apply. And when I'm thinking particularly about making sure that we have diverse voices represented in tech more broadly, that's a question that I often talk about. Something I often talk about is just pick your phone up, look at the apps that you use every single day for every single thing. Who are they founded by? Who are they funded by? Who's coding them? Who's building them? Who benefits from them? I think that's the thought that I'm talking about, right? And that's what makes me a little bit nervous. It's that giving over the thinking responsibility to AI is what makes me nervous. And so my response to that is, don't do that. My response to that is, we all need to get a little more active. For example, I talk about a lot and interviewed on my podcast Ida Tin. We're all aware of who she is. She founded Femtech. She created the word Femtech. She founded Clue. And I think it's something as simple as a menstrual health app that is founded, co-founded by, and funded by women, and is very careful with its data usage, and has a female CEO, Rhiannon White, and is thinking about the way in which the world appears to and is experienced by females at every step. It's using AI for prediction. And I think that's really interesting as well, because it starts taking us into that space of just not making assumptions, not making
100.
assumptions.
We spoke to Kate from She Codes, and she said the same thing with her. You know, the early sporting apps. They were clearly male designed, and we weren't using them. I certainly wasn't, and it wasn't until very recent days, with the rise of Pilates, really, that you can see a woman was involved in creating and designing the experience of the app. And yeah, thinking back to those days, it was definitely a man's operation in the early days. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
And I love what you're saying as well, Jen, because I feel like it's almost what you're saying is there's a call out for social responsibility for people to think more. And it's actually, you can almost see it in a positive way, this move to AI, because we're probably spent the last 10 years all scrolling and becoming thoughtless, I guess. And then with AI coming in really strong and fast, there is, and I've seen it, you know, with the Luddite Club in New York and things like that, there is a big swing for people to stop and think.
Touch grass.
Touch grass. And touch grass. And it's great. That's the real. You're seeing it pop up like globally especially with teenagers, and they're like, "Whoa, no. I need to think for myself. I need to be curious about the world for myself, you know." And I think that's kind of what you're saying is like it's our responsibility to be thoughtful. And that's kind of exciting in a way.
That's exactly what I'm saying. And what I love best about that, Kat, is you've said what I'm saying much more successfully than I did. I love that's exactly what I'm saying. Because I think that if, you phrase something around, there's a social responsibility to, like, yawn. It just sounds like a massive yawn. But it's not. It's really exciting. If you look at this generational shift, like I was talking with my daughter and my mum the other day on FaceTime, and my mum obviously just thinks it's absolutely hilarious that we're saying, like, no, touch grass, grounding. My mum's like, are you talking about going for a walk? Sorry, is this a thing that you now have to like have a conversation? Obviously being outside in nature. But I think that intentionality, and perhaps that's another iteration of it, right? Maybe 5 years ago it was about intentionality and now we're calling it something else. But I do think that there's a lot of doom and gloom around AI. And again, I'm not saying that I don't believe any of that is founded. Of course it is. But I think that the overwhelming sense that I have, and the reason that I got into tech and the reason that I love being in tech, is the positivity, is that anything's possible. I spoke with Cindy Gallop about the fact you can literally wake up in the morning, think, it's weird that that doesn't exist, and then invent it and make it exist. That's what tech can do.
I guess on that note, with Scott Farquhar in the news recently calling for copyright laws to change, what are your thoughts around that and the policies and government's responsibility or not around those laws changing?
Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating conversation. I first came into it from the perspective of authors, and particularly in Europe and in the UK, they were looking at re-legislating, because at the moment, the way that the law stands is that unless you say otherwise, it's kind of the modern opt-in, opt-out conversation, right? Unless you say otherwise, if you have a published piece of work, then an LLM can read it and learn from it.
Yeah.
And so the European, or in fact, I think in this case, the British Parliament were working to change that legislation and saying, no, it should be the other way around. And if LLMs are scraping existing authors' work, then the authors should be financially benefiting from that. I think more broadly, then it raises the conversation around IP. And as creatives, that's always been an interesting playing field for us, right? You work for an agency, you have a great idea, nobody buys it, but technically it belongs to the agency. Like, is AI the new version of that? Or if we go back to our earlier conversation, you're brainstorming in AI, what happens to that IP then?
Yeah.
Does that suddenly, now we know that if you're sharing a conversation in AI, it can be searched. Does that mean then that the idea that you had that was kind of half formed that you were just playing through with an AI model is now open socially?
Yeah.
And these are the conversations that we need to be having at a much faster pace than we are currently having. Particularly if we look at Australia in several ways, we've, led lots of world firsts from a tech perspective, like our digital driver's license, pieces like that. We have Atlassian here, we have Canva here. It's not like we're backward in that way. But I think from a legislative perspective, we absolutely need to be catching up, and it needs to be hand in hand with things like the 36 months campaign, which kind of have that broader societal and parental impact. We need to be looking at the legislature around copyright and IP as well.
Yeah, I find it obviously as a creative, I'm like clutching my pearls. But then when you also look at it more broadly, if we don't adapt, then Australia is behind. You think of it in that respect, and we're suddenly way behind the others, and then we're at a disadvantage. Yeah, again, it's all nuanced, and sitting on the fence seems to be the safest place.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think that, again, if you look at the Scandinavian countries, so let's look at the two examples we've spoken about today, right? So in terms of legislating against AI creating deep fakes of people, and also from a copyright perspective, those are laws that are happening and they are being passed. And then let's look at 36 months movement and the move up the age to 16 for teens using social media. I think one of the things about change, particularly at that government level, is we kind of view it, or traditionally have viewed it, as a one and done. Once the legislation's in place, once a law's in place, well, that's it. Okay, tough. You can't change that now. That needs to be changed too, right?
Yeah.
Because society is moving so fast, tech is moving so fast, it needs to be more a line in the sand.
Yeah.
We've made this decision. This is what we feel is right for now. We are going to put some guardrails around it. We are going to put some laws around it. And we are also going to keep revisiting it. And we are going to keep evolving it as best suits the society that we're in. So I think you're absolutely right, Claire. If we don't do that in Australia particularly, we become this sort of tech backwater again. And there's a real balance that we've got in this country between extraordinary, like, tech pioneers and then slightly backward thinking. We need to make sure we're pushing that in the right direction.
We're speaking a lot about government's responsibilities, and for anything, government and legislation moves very, very slow and can't keep up. But is there a responsibility, especially for the tech companies that have started in Australia, to put in their own parameters when they've got so much power to have those discussions and put those in place as well?
Yeah, I absolutely think there is. And I think it needs to be part of the planning process as well. Look, it is a favourite of mine, but it's a good thing to talk about because I know the case study well. But for example, one of the reasons that Clue was founded and exists where it exists in EMEA is because of the data protection rules there. So I think that's a great example. Let's think about that when we're founding tech businesses in Australia. And when you get to a level, as Scott has done now, when you get to a level like a Canva or an Atlassian, when you're starting to really change the global conversation as well, then we need to be looking at both ends, I argue. So when you're starting out, what are we doing here? How does this work? I've been talking a bit with Lucy Keogh, who founded Tap the Gap, and looking at the financial responsibilities around that and what exists in Australia and what she can be doing to meet and better those standards to make sure that Tap the Gap is globally leading in that way. I think you're absolutely right. It's interesting, isn't it? We've talked, it seems like our conversation is a lot around those different levels of responsibility. But I think that on a broader level, that has to be part of the human response to AI. We now live in a world where so much tech is kind of out of that scope of individual control and individual understanding. We need to all be thinking about, okay, so where are those different gatekeepers in terms of how we make sure that we maintain what feels right from a human perspective? So there's different layers of responsibility from the individual to business, then society more broadly.
I love that idea, Jen, because I do think as a creator, you want the option to, as you said, opt in, opt out. So
Yeah,
it sounds,
and I mean,
yeah,
that's the thing. If we look at the way that creative, if you think about the entertainment world, everything that's blowing up now is kind of IP based, franchises of things. And so if you're the person who's had the original thought behind that, you want to make sure that that's something that you have some involvement in, whether it's financial payback and or creative control. And I think that works on the micro level as well. So it might be a campaign that you've created for a client. It doesn't have to be this massive like piece of entertainment franchise that's seen everywhere. It should also impact all of us who are creating at a micro level as well.
Well, I think we've spoken about it a lot as creatives and how it actually is a tool, but there's a lot of big tech companies that are actually replacing a lot of people with AI. So it is obviously replacing a lot of roles. So I guess because you've just got so much experience and you're talking to all these tech companies, what's the feeling around it? And I know you've spoken a lot about, you know, you probably shouldn't be like tech so unstable, right? So if you go into tech, you've got to be prepared for it to be unstable. Do you still feel that way? Because I've heard those comments
Well, and
from
this
you a
is
while
where the
ago.
fear, this is where the, sorry to interrupt, but this is where the fear is coming from with AI. It's about being made redundant in your role. And so I guess, can we talk to that a little bit? Obviously, roles are going to be replaced by AI. What's the answer for us and the human race that are being made redundant? I know that's so hard, but can we talk about that?
Big question.
No, I think let's talk about, look, we're getting into the meaty questions today, so why not talk about it? And I think that it's interesting when you say that, Kat, it's absolutely true. I talk a lot about the uncertainty and instability of tech and of advertising, the more broad storytelling and creative industries too. I think that sometimes, if taken out of context, that can sound a little bit like I lack emotional intelligence myself. But I should be really clear. I should be really clear that I, in my career, have been made redundant a number of times. I worked in tech and advertising, of course I have. But I think that what we need to do within the tech environment is be looking at that broader picture. Yes, absolutely. There are a lot of roles being lost to AI, and it's very clear that that's the case. And in the best cases where brands are being really honest, they are communicating that with the people who are losing their roles. I think that it would be very flippant and naive to say that that's not happening and that it's not going to continue to happen. But again, I come back to my center is always around the possibilities of tech. I've been personally impacted by it. Of course I have, after 20-something years in advertising and tech. It's very up and down. But I think that to be blind to the possibilities of it is the real tragedy. There are so many people doing so many exciting and hopeful things, particularly if we look at financial tech and tech in diversity and health tech and femtech. These are spaces which, you know, to go back to our earlier conversation, Claire, it's only one generation since women weren't allowed to apply for mortgages on their own in the UK.
I know.
I was just reading about that the other week. And, you know, it's, what was it, 1998 before we were allowed to talk about periods. And we've only just started using red dye in advertising because women have been this like very frightening thing that we can't talk about in storytelling. I think where I go with tech is, and where I very intentionally center myself with tech, is the opportunity. I'm very well aware that I'm not across the full intersectionality of diversity, but particularly for women in tech, the opportunities I think have never been bigger. Really at a founder level, at a funder level, but also at a societal level. If you look at someone like Alina Timofeeva, who I spoke to recently on the pod, she is an extraordinary example of using tech to take yourself from a back office function to really a world leading function now. You know, she's advising presidents and prime ministers on what to do with tech. And that has happened entirely through her own pragmatic and optimistic approach to tech. So I think if we take a sweeping view, we are in a moment of unprecedented change. It is the biggest change since the Industrial Revolution, and there's no two ways about that. And for me, if you sit and think about that, it can become overwhelming. And for me, on an individual level, overwhelm often leads to inaction. So I choose to focus on the positive.
And it is a positive because it's almost weirdly like an unbiased kind of opportunity in a way. There's a lot of women, we're obviously in the space where we're dealing with tech companies, but there's a lot of women that would find it overwhelming and to even get started on or even use something like ChatGPT What advice would you give to women? Because we do need everyone to go on this journey. We want the good people, in there using it to be able to train it, to be able to make these positive changes that you're talking to.
It can be overwhelming. Do you know, this is a question I've been thinking about a lot recently. And as you rightly said, like, we're all in this tiny little bubble ecosystem, like particularly on our podcasts where we're talking about this space of what's happening in AI and how much it's changing the world and how much tech is changing the world. And it's often upon us to remember that the other 98% of the population aren't as across it as we are and aren't having these conversations, right?
Yeah.
So I think, again, I'm afraid I'm going to come back to personal responsibility, but there is a conversation to be had around those of us who are in it continuing to talk about it and to make it easier and more approachable for the vast majority of people who are not in it. And I think as many different ways in as possible to using tech is the right way to that. Right way maybe is a little clunky, but is the way that I see having most success at the moment. And what I mean by that is kind of a number of the different things that we've talked about today. So it could be as simple as someone saying, oh, I don't get all this AI nonsense. What is it anyway? Well, then so talk to them about an app on their phone and how maybe that's using AI. Which bits of that app are actually AI? And just finding the same with any storytelling, finding some shared ground or something that they're really interested in. And then I think for me, the answer in terms of actually using AI, like an LLM, for example, is just get in and have a go. And what's good about it is because we're so early in the journey, there's still no such thing as a silly idea. There's no such thing as a silly prompt, just have a play with it and see where it takes you. I think the other conversation to be having as ever is how we get more women and diverse groups into the tech industry, because we're still looking at 30% or fewer of roles in STEM filled by women. So us sitting here today is, like 90% of the Australian population. I jest, obviously. But I think it's also that attitude. Maybe I'm just thinking a lot about ripple effects at the moment, but I do think that attitude of just being willing to try something out, have a brainstorm. If you're a creative already, have a brainstorm in an LLM, see how daft it is, see if you love it, see if it gives you anything. I do think that attitude and our kids just picking up tech and AI as if it's nothing, putting those together, they do compound into a world in which more women are in tech. And then you start being able to have the conversations about you can see it, so you can be it. You have women leading tech, you have women leading tech companies and being very vocal about it, and it just becoming the norm. Look, it's a conversation that happens a lot, and people say often on Flip the Focus, but really our job in our generation is so that our kids' generation don't need to have these conversations at all.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
While we're talking about kids and the next generation, I know you mentioned you have a daughter and she's around 13. So I've got a boy and two girls. They're much younger, but we had to prepare a speech for school, and Teddy, my son, was like, just get on ChatGPT, Mum. It'll write it for me. And I was just like,
you were but it was a little bit of vomit in your mouth.
Yeah, I was like, yes, it will, but I shouldn't do this. We have to do it together. So it's like, okay, this is segue, but as a parent, how have you approached using AI in a responsible way with your children who are obviously exposed to it and know it's there, are better at it than us? But when it comes to homework, obviously it's more visible and we can see what's going on. This was my first experience and I had to really think about what my approach would be. Give us your insights on that, please, because you're ahead of us.
Do you know
Jen, give us your parenting advice.
Okay. Oh my God. I'll give it to you. You don't have to take it. So I have two kids. I have a son and a daughter, and my son's, I think, much closer to your age. My son Buster is 8 and Rosie's 13. And so With Rosie, she strangely, and it has nothing to do with genetics, is big into writing. And so we actually have lots of conversations about AI and about tech. And interestingly, I probably approached it in quite an old-fashioned way, actually. I just see all these conversations as starting from when I decided I wanted to be a parent. One of the things that I wanted to be able to do differently than my parents' generation was to have big, horrible, tricky conversations really early. And so I follow a lot of the people who say early and often, just talk about everything in age appropriate language from as soon as they can understand stuff. Now, being at the dinner table with me, Buster hears a lot about AI and female centered tech and all of those conversations. And so he's interested and he asks questions. And I think that that open conversation is great. So then if we move to Rosie, my 13-year-old, is it okay to type a question into Perplexity? Is it all right if I ask Copilot to help with this? So then my answer to that is always, it's okay to type it in, but it's not okay if it's doing the thinking for you. So if you're having a conversation with it and you're using AI as another human being, great. That's okay. If it's doing the thinking for you, it's not okay. If you get to the end of a piece of homework and you read the question and you know no more about it than you did before you did the homework, well, you failed because you've learnt nothing.
Yeah. It's almost like instilling. It's interesting because it's almost like this would obviously have happened 100 years ago with something else. We've got a new value that we have to instill and a moral conversation that we have to instill in our children.
This is why I said you don't have to take it, because this is what happens when you ask a social scientist for parenting advice or like big society moral dilemma on you. But I also
I'm going to speak to my 3-year-old this summer, and he's just going to be like, "What are you talking about?"
You know, simple things like, can the AI sit your nap plan next year? Like, I'll be asking those questions too. I'm like, you do what you like, but when you get into the exam room, there'll be no AI there. So fill your boots. Like, it's a bit of both. You've got to be practical as well as that ongoing conversation of the broader. But I find it really interesting. And now my 13-year-old, you know, in the way that they all have, she is extraordinarily, quite obviously, much smarter than me already and will ask questions back. Why are you not doing this with AI? Well, why haven't you just automated that?
Just before we wrap up, because I do find it fascinating, how is she actually using AI? Normally we would ask you this question in your everyday, but I would like to know, how is she using AI in her everyday?
Really, it's mostly around schooling and questions at this point. So one of the ways that I'm trying to balance or learn about it together is, we used to have a thing in our family called after dinner media, you know, where you'll like share like cool memes or fun stuff you've seen, and it's kind of evolved into after dinner AI. We like Perplexity and we will ask it questions together. So during dinner, when they're asking me stuff that I don't know, and it's both of them, the 8-year-old often outsmarts me as well. We will ask it together afterwards. And I think it's that learning through doing, right? So we'll ask it together afterwards, and then I will ask them questions. So when it says something quite demonstrably ridiculous, I'll be like, does that seem sensible? Or what do you think about that? Can we have another conversation with that? So we use it like that. And then for her schoolwork, she mainly uses it from a conversational perspective, like well, she's being raised by a creative, right? So she uses it in a kind of creative partner way. Brainstorming,
troubleshooting,
like ideation. She kind of does that, you know, where you have like 100 ideas in 10 minutes. She kind of does that with it, and then she'll narrow it down. So yeah, in short, I'm raising a small creative director.
Perfect.
Or worse, that's what's happened.
Well, we need a new generation of those.
Yeah,
Totally.
I'm quietly leading her into it, whether she knows it or not.
Yeah. And they'll definitely know how to train AI.
Yeah. Thank you so very much for coming on our show, Jen. You are an absolute pleasure to speak to. And I feel like we could ask you 1,000 more questions if we had, you know, a few days to do a very long podcast.
Thank you so much. It's weird being on the other side of the mic sometimes, but I've enjoyed it. And thank you so much.
Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, team.
See ya. Bye. So that's it for this episode of Femmebot, the podcast powering women in tech. If you liked what you heard, hit subscribe and share.